The night everything cracked open did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, in the hum of a workshop long after the cameras were gone, when the noise of engines had finally stopped and only memory remained. Bad Chad stood surrounded by metal creations that had once felt like proof of survival, proof that pain could be reshaped into power. Yet in that silence, the weight of years pressed down harder than any machine ever could. Fame had arrived, applause had followed, and still, something essential had been slipping away, unnoticed by millions watching from the outside. What happens when the world celebrates a man who is privately unraveling? When the bond between a father and a son, built under sparks, sweat, and survival, begins to fracture under the glare of expectation. This is not the story people think they know. It is a story of ambition forged in hardship, love expressed through labor, and a legacy threatened by the very success it created. The question lingers in the dark like unfinished steel. Was the price of building everything simply losing what mattered most? Before the fame, before the cameras and roaring crowds, there was silence. Thick, unyielding, and formative. It wrapped itself around Chad's early life like cold steel, shaping him long before he ever learned how to shape anything else. Stability was never guaranteed. Home was less a place of comfort and more a proving ground, where endurance mattered more than expression and emotions were liabilities that slowed survival. From a young age, Chad learned to read the world through tension rather than tenderness, to measure safety by what he could control with his own hands. Metal became that control. The workshop was not loud in the way people imagine. It breathed with a steady rhythm, punctuated by sparks and the dull thud of tools against raw material. Here, Chad discovered something life had rarely offered him: cause and effect without betrayal. Steel did not judge. It did not leave. It responded honestly to pressure, and in that honesty he found purpose. Each creation carried an unspoken translation of his inner world. Pain hammered flat, anger bent into function, loneliness welded into strength. Yet even as his skills sharpened, something remained unresolved beneath the surface. Chad's growing confidence in his craft masked an emotional distance he barely recognized. Worth, in his mind, became inseparable from output. If his hands were busy, his thoughts stayed quiet. If he stopped moving, memories crept in, reminders of everything he had learned not to need. The workshop filled with machines and parts, but the silence inside him never fully lifted. People around him saw dedication. They admired the hours, the discipline, the refusal to quit. What they did not see was the quiet belief driving it all: that rest was dangerous, and vulnerability was a weakness inherited from a world that had never been gentle. Chad carried that belief forward, unaware it was shaping more than his work. It was shaping the way he loved, the way he listened, the way he braced himself against loss before it could arrive. Then fatherhood entered his life, not as a dramatic moment, but as a subtle fracture in the armor he had spent decades building. Holding his son for the first time, Chad felt something unfamiliar and terrifying. Responsibility not just for survival but for softness. The promise formed instantly, without words. His son would not grow up the way he had. Pain would not be the teacher. Silence would not be the guide. Yet even as that promise took shape, Chad did not yet understand how deeply his own scars would complicate it. The workshop would one day become a shared space. The silence would one day be broken. But in this moment, standing alone with a future he could not yet imagine, Chad remained exactly who he had always been: strong, driven, and quietly unprepared for the bond that would test everything he believed about strength. The workshop changed the day the lad first stepped inside. Not because the space looked different, but because Chad did. The air still smelled of oil and scorched metal. The floor still vibrated with the low hum of machinery. Yet something softer entered with the child's cautious footsteps. Chad did not know how to explain love in words, so he translated it the only way he knew how: through instruction, through presence, through work done side by side. Teaching became affection. Correction became care. Silence became belonging. Under flickering fluorescent lights, the lad learned to listen before he spoke, to watch hands before asking questions. Chad's approval was never loud, but it was powerful. A nod, A pause, the rare moment when he let his guard slip just enough to say, "That'll hold." Those moments anchored the boy. They were proof that he mattered. Together, they built machines that looked fearless, heavy, unbreakable, and in doing so, they built an identity that fused fatherhood with craftsmanship so tightly it became impossible to separate the two. When cameras arrived, they did not feel like intruders at first. They felt like witnesses. The world saw what Chad had never learned how to articulate: a father and son bound by effort, loyalty, and shared purpose. Viewers admired the authenticity, the grit, the sense that nothing was staged. But what felt natural in private began to shift under public attention. Every success was amplified. Every mistake lingered longer. The workshop was no longer just a refuge, it was a stage. Chad felt pride, but also pressure he did not name. He wanted to protect the lad from the instability he had known, yet he unknowingly replaced it with expectation. The boy was no longer just learning a craft. He was representing a legacy. Praise from strangers poured in, and with it came a quiet burden, the need to perform closeness rather than simply live it. The lad began to sense that his value, like his father's, was being measured in productivity and perception. Small fractures formed in ordinary moments. Chad corrected more than he encouraged. The lad hesitated before speaking, gauging whether curiosity would be welcomed or dismissed. Love was still there, deeply rooted, but it had become rigid, shaped by routine and reputation. Neither of them noticed how rarely they spoke about fear, or doubt, or the future beyond the workshop walls. As the audience grew, so did the distance between who they were and who they were expected to be. The bond remained visible, admired, even envied, but it was quietly changing. What had once been private and sacred now belonged partly to the world. And somewhere between the sparks and the silence, something fragile began to strain. The chapter closes not with an argument, but with a look. A moment where the lad's eyes linger just long enough to reveal uncertainty, and Chad turns back to his work, unaware that the space between them has begun to widen, and that fame has already started pulling at the seams. The roar of cameras, the glow of lights, the constant hum of expectation. It arrived slowly, like a tide creeping into a room that once belonged only to Chad and the lad. Fame was not sudden, yet it carried a weight that felt instantaneous. Every word measured, every movement scrutinized, every achievement amplified beyond comprehension. Chad had spent a lifetime shaping metal, honing control over unyielding elements. Now he faced a new kind of material public perception. It refused to bend, refused to yield, and yet demanded perfection. In the workshop, the air thickened with tension. Machines continued to hiss and grind, but the space no longer belonged solely to those who had built it. The cameras captured every glance, every misstep, every moment of silence, translating it into applause or critique for millions. Chad felt his identity fusing with the persona everyone adored. A man of steel hands and unwavering determination. But behind that polished surface, doubt seeped in like smoke through cracks in the walls. What had once been a sanctuary now resembled a cage, and the keys were locked somewhere outside of his control. The lad, now older, stood at the edge of this new reality, navigating the same space with caution. Admiration and frustration warred within him. He wanted to honor the lessons, to carry forward the legacy, yet he also longed to breathe outside the shadow of his father's reputation. Every instruction from Chad now carried a dual weight: practical guidance and implicit expectation. Every compliment lingered longer, shadowed by the unspoken pressure to perform not just skillfully, but publicly. Moments of joy were now intertwined with the unease of visibility. The workshop that had once been a world unto itself had become a theater. Tension built quietly, unnoticed at first. Words were clipped. Glances held more weight than conversation. The lad began to question whether he was loved for who he was, or for what he could produce. Chad, too consumed by the relentless drive to maintain his image, failed to notice the subtle distance growing with every passing day. The father who had once shaped machines with precision now struggled to shape moments of connection with the son he had vowed to protect. Inside him, fear fermented. A fear that failure, even unseen, would undo everything he had fought to build. Public appearances, interviews, and fan expectations became relentless. The applause felt intoxicating yet hollow. It affirmed skill, but it could not reassure a heart stretched thin by worry and unspoken guilt. Chad felt trapped between two worlds, the one that demanded spectacle and the one where love quietly awaited acknowledgement. Each day ended the same way, with fatigue pressing into his chest, the workshop quiet except for the echo of his own thoughts, wondering if he could ever balance the demands of fame with the demands of fatherhood. Then came a moment that marked the turning point. A subtle argument, a glance that lingered too long, a question from the lad that Chad could not answer. The cameras did not capture it, the fans did not see it, but in that instant, the invisible line began to fracture. The bond that had once seemed indestructible now trembled under the weight of expectation, and for the first time, Chad realized that control could not be regained simply by working harder. Something precious was slipping beyond his grasp, a realization that terrified and haunted him in equal measure. And yet, the workshop continued to hum, indifferent to the fissures forming within its walls, as if the machines themselves were witnesses to a fracture no one could repair with tools alone. Chad and the lad stood side by side, the same yet fundamentally changed, and the question lingered in the silent spaces between them. Could the bond survive the very fame that had once seemed like a gift? The fallout did not come with a crash of cameras or the flash of media lights. It came quietly, creeping in through the spaces that had once held laughter, learning, and shared purpose. The workshop, once alive with the rhythm of sparks and steel, now felt hollow, the air heavy with absence. Machines still groaned and hissed, but they no longer carried the warmth of connection. They echoed the emptiness that had quietly spread between father and son. Chad, who had spent decades mastering control, now confronted a force he could not shape: distance. Every interaction became a subtle negotiation. Words went unspoken, gestures deferred, glances flicked and vanished before acknowledgement. Chad felt the weight of silence pressing into his chest, a constant reminder that presence without understanding was insufficient. He had thought that love could be expressed through labor, through instruction, through the meticulous shaping of metal into purpose. Now he realized that absence could live even in the midst of attention, that success did not shield one from loss. The lad, sensing the shift, stepped back. His movements were deliberate, measured, seeking space where he could breathe, where he could exist outside the shadow of expectation. The admiration of millions could not fill the gap left by a father who no longer seemed fully present. The child's quiet withdrawal became a mirror to Chad's own unacknowledged fears, that he had built his life around creation and image, and in doing so, neglected the human bonds that mattered most. Guilt, once an abstract concept, became tangible, pressing into him at odd moments. The soft hum of machinery in the dark, the echo of a laugh that no longer reached him, the stillness of a room that had once vibrated with shared effort. Chad questioned every decision, every method of teaching, every moment he had believed that hard work could substitute for attention, for empathy, for emotional presence. His legacy, once a source of pride, now seemed incomplete, fragile, vulnerable to the erosion of neglect. And yet, even in the darkness, there was clarity. The fracture revealed truth, that strength without presence is a kind of absence, and that what had been built with skill and determination could still crumble without care. In these quiet, raw hours, Chad confronted the terrifying reality that some lessons were not taught with tools or sparks but with listening, with patience, with vulnerability he had long avoided. The chapter closes in the dim light of the workshop. Chad stands alone, hands resting on the cold metal of a machine that he had once imagined as a bridge between worlds. The noise of the workshop seems distant, almost mournful, a sound that echoes the hollow spaces in his heart. Outside, the world celebrates the achievements it sees. Inside, the weight of what has been lost presses down, relentless and undeniable. And in that moment, Chad faces a question he cannot ignore, one that will shape every step to come. Is it too late to rebuild the bond he has fractured, or has the silence grown too wide to bridge? The answer remains unseen, suspended like sparks in the darkness, leaving the audience suspended with him in a moment of fragile, aching uncertainty. In the quiet aftermath, when cameras were gone and applause faded to nothing, Chad faced the reflection of a life built on effort, fame, and expectation. The workshop remained, tools polished, machines lined in meticulous order, but its heart had changed. Absence had carved spaces in ways no metal could fill, and Chad understood that legacy was no longer measured in creations or public acclaim. It was measured in presence, in understanding, in the quiet acts that spoke louder than any roar of admiration. The lad's absence, once a source of frustration and despair, became a guide. Every empty chair, every silent corner, reminded Chad of what he had taken for granted, what had been assumed to be unbreakable. For the first time, he listened not to fans, not to cameras, not even to his own echoing thoughts, but to the echoes of those he loved most. In doing so, he discovered something he had long avoided. Strength was not solely the ability to build or endure. Strength was the courage to confront faults, to face regret, to step forward even when fear demanded retreat. Chad began to rebuild in small, deliberate ways. He called, he waited, he listened. He let the lad speak without interruption, without judgment, allowing space for emotions long suppressed to surface. It was slow. It was fragile. It was terrifying. Every interaction carried the weight of past fractures. Yet each moment of connection reinforced that repair, however tenuous, was possible. The workshop, once a theater of production, became a place of renewal, where mistakes were acknowledged and silence was finally met with voice. Fame, though still present in shadows and memories, no longer dictated action. Chad realized that his true legacy could not be measured in machines, in sparks, in audience applause. It was measured in love, in trust rebuilt, in the quiet consistency of showing up for the people who mattered. And in this realization, hope emerged, not dramatic, not sudden, but as a slow, persistent light in the darkness, illuminating the path forward. The chapter closes with Chad standing alone in the workshop once more, hands resting on cold steel, heart warmer with understanding, eyes tracing the spaces where absence had once lived. The lad's return is hinted, uncertain but possible, leaving the story poised between caution and renewal. Chad steps forward, not as a symbol, not as a figure on a screen, but as a father willing to face the consequences of past neglect, to embrace vulnerability, and to build a legacy that survives beyond steel, cameras, and applause. And though the future remains unguaranteed, one truth shines through the lingering shadows. Some legacies are forged not in metal, but in the quiet, deliberate work of healing what was once broken. The audience is left with the unspoken question, hanging in the air like the faint hum of machinery in an empty room. Can what was fractured truly be made whole again?